Big Ten Media Days. I wanted to talk for a couple of minutes on this. Did you guys hear Ohio State this week? Did you hear Ryan Day? Did you hear this team talking? I don't know. Like, if you're a Buckeye fan, I can understand. I can imagine how mad you were at the end of last year. But I can promise you it does not equate to how these dudes feel. And I'm not talking about in the days or weeks afterward. They walked into Big Ten Media Days and it felt like the Michigan game wrapped up about 45 minutes ago. And that's normally like Xbox mentality. Normally, it is really hard to bottle that kind of thing up and take it with you that long, but they have. Now, does that mean anything on the football field this fall? No, not necessarily, but it also very well could. It's definitely how you want your team to feel. Ryan Day said, look, I mean, he gave a quote. He said, 11-2 in a Rose Bowl, that's not quite good enough at Ohio State. He said, we got 3 preseason goals, and they are beat Michigan, he said the team up north. They are to win the Big Ten, and they are to win the national championship. And as far as I'm concerned, we went 0 for 3 last year. And they did. You know, I was at the Ohio State-Michigan State game last year, which is funny because that was a total splattering. That was as thorough a dominant performance as you will have seen up there last year. And then I was at the Ohio State-Michigan game, and we remember what happened there. They brought Jim Knowles in. We just talked about him with Oklahoma State. Jim Knowles was the former Cowboy defensive coordinator, and they hired him, and he is now the defensive coordinator at Ohio State. And it's important to note, you know, Ryan Day, when he brought him in there, I was listening to our buddy Zach Smith talk about this earlier today. He said, hey, they brought him in. They didn't say, here's your staff. They brought Jim Knowles in and said, go get your staff. And so he's pretty much, he being Ryan Day, he's pretty much said, here's what the expectation is going to be. I want you to have a top 10 defense, and you call the shots. I brought you in because I think you're the best. You go get your staff. You choose where you need to be on game day. You call the shots, but here's what I expect in return, and this is kind of what he echoed yesterday at Big Ten Media Day. He said, we got to have a Big Ten, or we got to have a top 10 defense. That's what we have to have. Now, realistically, I think if they were the 19th or 22nd best defense in the country this year, they would be well on their way to playing for another national championship. But that should be the standard. Why shouldn't that be the standard up there? It's Ohio State. It's not Ohio. All due respect to the Bobcats. Okay, I'm sure Athens is a great place this time of year, but we're talking about a group of folks who think the Big Ten championship is their preseason birthright. Vegas agrees, and yet they are not carrying that thing around. Michigan is right now. I can only imagine how much that eats at them. So luckily they got a crew back again this year. That's an interesting team to watch. Very interesting. And they don't start soft. They got Notre Dame in there, week 1. Next up, I could not help but be reminded how consequential this Penn State-Purdue game is going to be in week 1. It's a Thursday night game. So we got the backyard brawl. We got West Virginia and Pitt. We got Penn State and Purdue. And I think if you're, like, let's say you're a Mississippi State fan and you only really care about Mississippi State, it may be a little harder for me to sell you on those games, but most of you aren't just fans of your team. This is not Major League Baseball. Most of you, especially if you're watching this show, you got your team, but you also love the sport. And if you fit that category, it's not hard for me to sell you on this. But if you need me to, if you need the 15 or 20 second pay-per-view version, I want you to understand, in this rivalry, well, if you want to call it that, I mean, in this, Jesse, rivalry or no rivalry? Just matchup, right? Yeah, matchup. Matchup, okay. Well, in this matchup, Purdue hadn't won it since 2004, I think, and it's been 9 straight that Penn State's won. But, plus side, Purdue's coming off the first 9-win season they've had since 2003. We had to look up who the quarterback was back then. Anyway, that's not the pay-per-view sell. Here's the pay-per-view sell. Purdue's over-under win total is suspicious right now. It's floating 7-8, depending on where you look, but yet they won 9 games last year, and virtually the entire team, well, at least on the surface, because Aiden O'Connell's back at quarterback, a lot of the team looks like it returns, and a lot of people think they have a smart money bet taking the win total over for Purdue. And if they win in week 1, I don't know how you lose, because the rest of their schedule is so workable. And also, if Purdue were to win this game, do you understand what it feels like around Happy Valley? Do you understand what it feels like around Penn State? Because they will have already dropped a conference game. They'll be 0-1. Oh, and by the way, they will have a trip to Auburn in week 3. And so you're looking at the real possibility of starting 1-2. And I don't need to tell anyone how that would go over at Penn State. So I know a lot of folks are looking at that. And if that game were in week 5, you'd be tempted to kind of look over it. Well, it's not. That thing's sitting right there in week 1. And for a lot of this other stuff on Penn State's schedule to matter, man, they really need that win. I wasn't supposed to go in this order, but you know what? I'm going to do it anyway. Here we go. The Big Ten West, speaking of Purdue and their standing over there, Wisconsin, according to the media, the overwhelming favorite to win that division. And I look at the Big Ten West, I don't see an overwhelming favorite to do anything. And so I just find it peculiar. I mean, if you made me tabulate, my preseason, I guess I'd say Wisconsin slight, but I would follow it up with slight. I would say just that word. They got a new offensive coordinator there in Bobby Ingram, and with good reason, because they ranked 120 nationally in passing offense last year. And there were a lot of folks, and you're looking at one of them right here on this screen, who were very hopeful that that number would be much higher. I have no idea how anyone's an overwhelming favorite. There are 5 teams you could sell me on to win this division this year. And Wisconsin's one of them, Iowa's one, Nebraska, Minnesota, Purdue, just mentioned them, especially if they win versus Penn State in week 1. Some other things that caught my ear yesterday. We had Pat Fitzgerald from Northwestern. We had Mel Tucker. These were among the several coaches who were asked about the future of the sport. Where do you think it's going? And they kind of echoed the sentiment I heard down at SEC Media Days a lot last week. And that was, we don't like that we don't know a bunch of stuff. We don't know how big our conference is going to be. We don't know what the rules are going to be. There's so much we don't know. And we just wish we had better guidance on it. That is a familiar theme. I'm telling you, that is one of the top things being talked about behind the scenes. There's a very sizable event happening in Nashville next week where a lot of folks from the more football operations, recruiting operations, behind the scenes areas of college football will be in town. I'll be over there for that. It is the number one topic on everyone's mind, and that is mapping out the future of college football. More on that later, as much as I can tell you. But in the meantime, you got a lot of coaches out there, coaches who have been around the block, who kind of have to throw their hands up and say, I'm just going to worry about what I can control over here. And usually that's a lot more than what it feels like I can control right now. Also, the Michigan quarterback situation, I know some people want a definitive starter written in stone. That's not the way it's going to be there. It wasn't last year. It's not going to be this year. But Cade McNamara, you kind of get that he is the starter there. Jim Harbaugh keeps pointing out, I start guys based on how the drives they're on the field for end. Which is kind of common sense, right? Well, McNamara's drives end in points over 50% of the time, or at least they did last year. And the other thing to keep in mind, and this is where it kind of gets interesting, they start with Colorado State, UConn, Hawaii, and Maryland. It's one of the softest opening months of any major team out there, which means they can afford to do whatever they want to at quarterback, and that means they're going to probably rotate a healthy amount. Here's what I always think about. What if, I wouldn't say this is a risk, it's just a what if for whatever reason, you got a couple of games there where McNamara just doesn't have it. Just doesn't have his A game. Doesn't have the game you know he's capable of playing and you've seen him play before, and McCarthy just lights it up. And you've told guys, hey, whoever plays best in these first few games now, that's how I'm going to determine the rest of the season. And then the guy you think is second best ends up outshining the guy that you really trust more. What do you do? What do you do? I've seen this happen a couple of times. What do you do? But then again, the counter to that is, well, what better metric would you have than on-field competition? Fact of the matter is, if one guy's getting it done on the field on a Saturday in the fall, that's what it's all about, right? These are not tune-up games. They kind of are, but they all count. So keep an eye on that Michigan quarterback rotation, I guess I would call it.